everybody. We are back at the barn today and we're going to talk about some parts of a saddle. You guys typically ride in an English saddle. You may see a Western saddle every now and then when we are doing riding here at camp, but this is one of our Western saddles and we're going to go over some of the parts. A lot of the parts are the same as an English saddle has. Some of them are a little different. I think you guys can probably see one of the ones that's definitely different than in English, and that is the horn. And Miss Caitlin is going to go point to the horn. Thank you, Caitlin. The horn is located on the pommel of the saddle. It also has a swell and a fork there. The back of the saddle is called the cantle. There's also some shiny silver conchos on this saddle, giving it a little bit of a bling. Oh, Miss Caitlin, can she find them? Alrighty, there's a skirt on a Western saddle, just like on an English saddle. There's a fender on a Western saddle though, which is something that an English saddle does not have. And we have stirrups down there at the bottom. Those are a caged safety stirrup. They're often used in endurance because they've got a little bit wider footbed and cushion footbed. The cage is on there so that our rider's foot cannot slip all the way through. The girth on a Western saddle is quite a bit different than on an English saddle. You can see it only has one buckle instead of two buckles like an English saddle has. The girth is attached to the latigo or the off billet. And I'm going to reach in here and flip the girth out real quick. Don't look at me, I'm dirty. I've been here all morning. There's rollers on the opposite end of that girth, which makes it easy to cinch it up because your latigo on the other side will slide right through. In the middle of it, we have two rings, which is kind of different than an English saddle. On an English girth, there's usually just the one ring on the front for attaching. Oh my goodness, it's too hot and my brain isn't working. Help me, Caitlin.
Press collar?
Yes, thank you. Attaching one of those two. On a Western girth, you have a D-ring on the back also, and that is to attach a flank cinch to. The flank cinch attaches to the back of the saddle. We don't have one on this saddle. We typically don't use them here. We don't necessarily need them. If they are not hooked up properly, they can really be a problem for the horse and cause a lot of trouble, so it's just a safety thing. We prefer not to use them here. And on the other side of the saddle is another latigo, and that is where you tighten your cinch up on a Western saddle. There's a couple different ways that you can secure your cinch. We're not going to do that today because the saddle isn't on a horse, but maybe in another video we will talk about that. So there you go, guys. There's the parts of the Western saddle, and Caitlin is going to give you the parts of an English saddle.
So today we're going to talk a little bit more about saddles and stuff. So these are all different types of English saddles. So you can see this first one has a flap, which is this. That's pretty short and you can't see the billets unless you lift up the flap underneath of here. Versus this saddle, which has a little bit longer of a flap just because it's a bigger saddle. This is my saddle. And it has really long billets. There's no flap, so it's called a mono flap, which means it has one flap versus the two flaps on this saddle. And we'll talk about what they're each called and everything. This one has a way longer flap than the first two, and these long billets. This one's not a mono flap. It has two flaps, but it's a lot bigger and a lot longer of a flap than our first saddle. Our first saddle is called an all-purpose saddle. Now this is what most of you guys will be riding in when you're here. It is kind of a general all-over saddle. You can see that somebody short rode this pony in this saddle last because the stirrups are actually rolled. So we do that because there's not always enough holes in our stirrup leathers to actually have a short enough stirrup. These particular stirrups are called peacock stirrups. So this rubber band here is designed to pop down to have your foot fall out in case you get stuck or fall off or anything happens to you. So this is an all-purpose saddle. This is actually Spirit saddle. So it's a smaller seat then the next two, you can see this saddle and this saddle are actually my saddles, and they get used on Bodhi, and Bodhi's a lot bigger of a horse than Spirit is. Now Spirit has a smaller seat, which is this part of the saddle, because she has smaller kids ride her who have smaller butts than I do. Now what we have laying over the saddle here is called a girth. This goes underneath of Spirit's belly. It has elastic on both sides, so it makes it pretty easy for Spirit to breathe. And the girth attaches under this flap onto these billets. These three are called billets. Now there's a couple different ways that people use these billets. The traditional way is to use this last one and the first one, not the second one. The second one's in case of emergency if the first or the last one breaks. So there are also other ways to use these billets. If you have a pony with a really, really big belly and not so much shoulder, you can use these first two to kind of trap it down onto the shoulder. You can use these second two if you have a pony that likes to bloat a little bit and you need to suck them down on the back side of the saddle versus the front side of the saddle. All of our ponies are pretty much on the first and third. We don't really use the middle one at all. Now that's Spirit's saddle. And that's called an all-purpose saddle. So this is mine and Bodhi's saddle. I use this saddle if I'm jumping someone, or if I'm going out on trail, or I am going and doing a gallop set or a trot set, or I'm doing any sort of exercise riding with Bodhi versus a lesson or anything like that. The cool things about this saddle is it kind of locks me in place. So when this stirrup is down, my leg sits here, and this little block back here helps me keep my calf in place, and this little block up here helps me keep my thigh in place. So you can see that there are these really long billets on his saddle versus Spirit's saddle that have very short billets. This is designed for this type of girth. So it's a way shorter girth versus Spirit's longer girth because of those long billets. So you can see Spirit has a little bit deeper of a seat than Bodhi's does. It's a little bit flatter so that I can get up out of his way a little bit easier. Everything else is kind of the same on this saddle versus Spirit's saddle, but it's more geared towards jumping. This saddle only has one flap so that I can be closer to Bodhi, so that I can feel a little bit more of what he's doing. You can also see that these stirrups are solid stirrups because this is just my saddle. I am the only one that uses this saddle, and I'm always in correct footwear when I do use this saddle, so I don't need any sort of safety stirrup. This is the saddle that I use most often on Bodhi. This is my dressage saddle. So you can see it has a way longer flap, this right here, than my jump saddle, because my leg hangs a lot lower on this saddle than it does in my jump saddle. I've got a lot more bend in my knee when I'm in my jump saddle than when I'm in my dressage saddle. This saddle is for when I'm doing flat work or any sort of pattern stuff or any sort of dressage at all. I also use this sometimes when I go out on trails if I'm just walking and just doing flat ground stuff. Now you can see that these stirrups are the same as my jump saddle stirrups. They are not safety stirrups either. They are full solid stirrups because, again, I only ride in actual boots and proper footwear. So I don't need something that's gonna let my foot hang out if it happens. You can see that this saddle also has longer billets, and it uses the same girth as my jump saddle. This is Bodhi's girth. It's just long enough to go around his belly. This one is not a mono flap. It's got 2 flaps on it, and it's got a little bit deeper of a seat than the jump saddle. You see how it has a higher back here? It's got a little bit deeper of a seat versus the jump saddle, which doesn't have that deep of a seat. The dressage saddle is designed to kind of lock you in so that you can sit trot or be able to ask him to do a whole bunch of different movements versus the jump saddle. Here at Melwood we have a couple different bridles. We have this trail bridle, which is wonderful because everything comes off of it. So I can hook a lead rope onto a pony and use it as a halter without the bit and without the reins, or I can use this bridle as more of a hackamore where I'm just pulling on the pony's nose with the reins by hooking the reins onto the side here, or I can hook the bit on these little D-rings and then hook the reins to that. This is a great thing for our beginner riders, for going out on trail, for our adaptive lessons, kind of for a little bit of everything. I use this bridle a lot. This bridle is Bodie's dressage bridle, so it's black to match his saddle, and it's all solid. It has a brow band, which is right up here. This goes across the front of his face. This is the crown piece, which goes over his head like a crown. These are his cheek pieces that attach his bit onto his face. Here's his nose band, which goes around his nose, not too tight but not too loose. And then we have a throat latch, which goes on around his throat, not tight so that it chokes him or anything. And these are his reins. As you can see, everything is attached together, unlike our trail bridle, that everything comes apart.